I'm strictly a corn soybean rotation. We've been strip tilling now for 4 years, moving into cover crops. And part of the things I've started to learn here at the conference, I came down yesterday, is when you talk about, well, I'm going to try cover crops. Well, you're not actually going to try cover crops. If you are going to be successful at it, it's going to become part of your system. Your tillage is going to change, your rotations, your timing on your herbicides, all these things, weed control. These are all things that are going to change if you fully develop into cover crops. We're up here again, up in Cresco up here, northeast Iowa, Howard County. Cold, wet soils, glacial till soils. We always said up there, no-till can't work up here, it's too far north, and we've been at it for 27 years. This is some of my equipment, 16-row planter, combine. This is a strip till rig I purchased with a neighbor last spring who's sitting here, come down and see me, thanks. And then we no-till drill our soybeans on 15-inch rows. We started ridge tilling in 1988, and if you remember, that was the last drought prior to the year previous to this. And my dad farmed with me, still does now. He's 81 years old, but at the time, we got 65 bushel of corn that year after the drought, and our first year of ridge tilling. And so he kind of looked at me and was half joking, half serious, says, well, that doesn't work. But we proceeded, we kept going with the ridge till, and we did it for nearly 20 years. And then we got to a size, we started farming more acres. We're up to approximately 2,000 acres now. You just couldn't cover the ground with a cultivator. And so we went to no-till and went to a 12-row planter. And I liked the no-till, but we were spreading our P&K on the surface. And I thought over time that we're going to start to see stratification. That became a concern of mine. So the main reason we went to strip till was so I could get the fertilizer in the ground. It wasn't for the tillage because I was happy with what I was doing with the no-till and the ridge till. It was more of a fertilizer placement rather than switching the tillage system. Started cover crops, planted some last year. Worked with a little bit with Dave and some others the previous year. But I've got some fields that have 27 years of continuous no-till now. And my son is a senior at Iowa State, and he wouldn't know how to hook a plow up or run it. I bought a plow a couple years ago. We had some CRP coming out, and it's just so rough that you have to plow it. And it was kind of fun doing back what I did when I was a kid, but I wouldn't want to do everything that way. The technology is coming, changing. I've got some landlords that are older, that are retired. And I keep saying, if you've been out of farming for 5 years, you really have no understanding of what we're doing today. I've got some landlords that you go and try to talk to them about the GPS and the modern systems and the biotech and the ethanol and $10,000 land and $400 rent, and it's just a whole new world out there. And what I'm seeing at this conference and others, that's continuing. It's going to get worse. It's going to get faster. I don't necessarily mean worse, but the change of pace. It took us 40 years to switch from tractors, or from horses to tractors. It changes now are 2 years. And I think we're going to start to see things that are going to change every year coming on board. I worked for the Iowa Department of Agriculture for 15 years. I did water quality projects in 3 counties. And so I was trying to get farmers to implement different management practices. And then I left the agency 11 years ago, and I formed the Three Rivers Ag Consulting. Basically what my business does, if it's related to agriculture and government paperwork, I'll tackle it. So manure management plans, CNMPs with NRCS. I'm a technical service provider, so I do a lot of nutrient management plans. So part of my theme today is kind of how are we going to manage nutrients with cover crops and what the benefits are of that. And then last year, another consultant and I, we bought an AgRobotics auto probe, and we started a new company called Soils Investigative Services. I'm getting into soil testing now. And it's kind of a neat machine that we bought. This is my client base. I'm up here, Cresco's in here. These are all the clients that I've worked with over time. I do get down some areas occasionally, but most of it's up in northeast Iowa. When I started the business, I did mostly manure management plans, and then I got certified as a technical service provider. I do a lot of CNMPs now. We also get into NPDS permits. I also do some work in Minnesota because we're so close. I have clients that have livestock facilities in both Iowa and Minnesota. The Iowa rules are complicated, and then I had to learn a whole new set of rules up in Minnesota, and it can be challenging. The business now, I've hired a new employee last fall. We're getting into adaptive nitrogen management through the Cornell model. looking in the cover crop seed, and then we're going to do soil testing as part of our business. This is the AgRobotics probe. This is a belt that just kind of comes around here, and it shoots a probe down in the ground, picks the soil up and blows it up in the cab, and then you bag it. And we can do 100 acres an hour with this machine. And part of it is Iowa State recommendations are you need 15 to 20 cores per sample that you soil test. Most of the consultants that I know don't do anywhere near that. At best, 10 to 12. A lot of them are pulling 5 cores per sample. DNR rules state that you need to use Iowa State's recommendations, which is 15 to 20 cores per sample, and I'll bet the majority of the soil tests that go across my desk do not meet that standard. I think we've got a machine that Pioneer and DeKalb both have indicated, they got their new field scripts programs. I think that's the DeKalb one. They're going to be looking at more managing on, instead of a 2.5 acre grid, maybe get down to an acre grid, and maybe in 5 to 10 years we might be managing by the foot. We need to know what are our soils there. So a guy down here pulling a hand probe, is he going to do a 1 acre grid? I had one guy tell me the other day, he says flat out, I wouldn't do it. Well, if they did do it, it would also probably double the price because of the labor involved. We've got a machine that I think can move with the technology. When I did work for NRCS Soil Conservation, we did a lot of conservation compliance plans, and you had to get down to acceptable soil loss on the average soil loss of your rotation. So like Dave here has a 3-year corn oat 3-year rotation, for example, on some steeper ground. Those plans are written for an average soil loss to meet a minimum standard. On my land, we're starting to see 50, 100, sometimes 500-year storms now. I think we need to plan for events rather than averages. You get a 3-inch rain, in 2 hours. If you're planning for an averages, it's not going to hold your soil in place. The agency, it's a 24-hour, 25-year storm is the standard that they build all their practices to. And again, we're seeing 100 and 500-year storms, and that's not good enough. So I want practices on my farm that are going to control your rainfall events, not the averages. Last year, Iowa land was up to $8,716 an acre. That was up a little over 5% from the previous year, but the thing is, it's up 469% since 2000. And if any of you are farming, this has been an incredible run the last 14, 15 years. I've seen land in my county go from $1,000 an acre to $12,000 an acre. Had a client of mine in Mitchell County paid $17,000 last fall. So we've seen, and if you've owned land, it can create wealth in a short period of time. If you have 80 acres now up our way, it's worth almost $1 million. Just an 80. The farmers used to make a living on 80 acres. So we're looking at average soil loss. If you got that corn oat hay rotation, you can put it in hay, and you got an average soil loss of very little here. And you can have it when it's in corn. You can do this, and you add these two together, and you get an average, and that's acceptable under certain standards. And I don't feel that that is acceptable. And NRCS only takes into account sheet and rill erosion through the soil loss equation. It doesn't account for ephemeral. They say you need to control ephemeral, but the Russell does not factor that in. I saw Dr. Rick Cruz at Iowa State in a program last fall. He said, what you do with this is you come in next year and you fill that in with tillage. And what fills it in? It's topsoil. And where are all your nutrients? Your nutrients are in your topsoil. So you fill this in, next year it rains, you've created a pipeline for your nutrients to leave your field. And I think that's a real good analogy there. What's a ton of soil worth? I came up with this. There's 2 million pounds of soil in 1 acre at a 6-inch depth. 2 million pounds is 1,000 tons. $10,000 an acre land divided by 1,000, that's $10 a ton, the value of your soil, just based on the bulk analysis, let alone what the nutrients are in it. And the number one pollutant, they're talking about the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy and what we need to do to reduce it. The number one pollutant in the country is not the nutrients, it's the sediment that leaves our fields going in the streams. And this is a field in Winneshiek County, a farmer I worked with. He felt that because he wasn't plowing, he did adequate soil conservation measures. He worked this field 6 times. This is continuous corn. Worked 6 times, and that's the kind of erosion he got. That's not acceptable. But this is the Root River in very southeastern Minnesota. Dave is just a little bit south of this. And it's similar to northeast Iowa. We're starting to see less and less livestock. They're selling the cows off. they're growing more corn, more beans, more intensive rotations, and you're starting to see this type of erosion when you get events. And just like I said, this looks like chocolate milk to me, going directly in the Mississippi River. So when you talk about nutrient management, most farmers know you have N, P, and K are your three macronutrients. The nitrogen, if you're dealing with that as runoff, it's water soluble. It can go in through the water. It's volatile. It can move into the atmosphere for greenhouse gases. And you have surface runoff. It's a human health concern, either directly by ingesting too much nitrate in the water, and it also creates algae blooms, which has fish kills and creates water that's not desirable. Phosphorus is a different animal. It's not water soluble primarily. If you start getting higher phosphorus levels, you can see some runoff in the tile line, but the majority, the only way it's going to leave your field is if it's attached to a soil particle. So I do a lot of phosphorus indexes when I do manure management plans, and I've got clients that are concerned my phosphorus soil tests are getting way too high. I'm going to have trouble with the P index. It's usually not an issue. The issue is you control your erosion, and that soil particle doesn't leave the field with phosphorus attached to it. The P index doesn't care. The P index is very heavily weighted to soil erosion. Potassium is the third macronutrient, but as far as I know, nobody's talking about that as a environmental hazard. There's no known direct human health hazard, and it hasn't been correlated to the algae blooms and that. So when you're talking about nutrient management standards, it's usually nitrogen and phosphorus. All right, if we're going to do nutrient management based on Iowa State recommendations, it's pretty simple what you do. They have what's called the MRTN, the maximum return to nitrogen. It's based on historical research, and the only two factors it takes into account are the price of corn and the price of nitrogen. And you can go online, it's a free thing, and you can run it on your own farm, put in the price of corn that you expect, put in the price of nitrogen. I run a lot of these when I do CNMPs, and what we found is that if you have a corn bean rotation, very rarely do I ever get outside of that 140, 150 pound recommendation with the MRTN. It seems that when the price of corn goes up, price of nitrogen goes up. Price of nitrogen, corn goes down, price of nitrogen goes down. So that ratio between the two is always in a fairly narrow range. Corn on corn, it always seems to fall in 190 to 200. Same thing. Corn goes up, nitrogen goes up. But the MRTN, like I said, the only two factors in it. It's a good starting point to say how much nitrogen do I need, but it doesn't factor in, the source. Is it anhydrous? Is it 28%? Your placement, are you putting it on the surface? Are you injecting it? Doesn't affect the timing, fall versus spring, and the weather factors aren't in there. But it's a good starting point. If you're using phosphorus and potassium, it's real simple. You take soil tests, and if you're low and very low, you put on removal rates plus some, and there's charts to tell you what that is. If you're at the optimum, you put on what the crop removes, and if you're high or very high, there's no economic benefit to adding any additional P and K. That's Iowa State's recommendation. So a very simple nutrient management plan if you follow their standards. This is somewhere up in Canada. This obviously is a polluted area with the algae growth. This was not, and I found this slide, but I don't know how this came about, but this kind of shows the effect that we have. Dr. John Lawrence is talking about the nutrient reduction strategy. I saw him last week. These are CCC structures in northeast Howard County. These are put in the 1930s. Matt Lechtenberg was hired to do the nutrient management reduction strategy in Iowa, and he was hired, last summer, last fall, and there's probably already people wondering why he hasn't solved the problem yet. Well, Dr. Lawrence made the point this nutrient reduction might take a generation or two to fully implement. It's not going to happen overnight, and I'm worried that perhaps the public isn't going to have that kind of patience. Last year we started cover crops. We had a lot of prevent planting. Like Dave said, about a third of my crop did not get planted. So we went out and we tried drilling some, and I tried broadcasting here. And both worked fairly effective. This is the annual rye. I got a good cover here, and we planted some radishes. I got a couple of free bags from Extension, and I tried that. Both look good. We'll see what happens in the spring. If you've seen Tim Recker, this is a quote I pulled off of him in one of the farm magazines. We think cover crops are eventually just going to be a part of production, and I totally agree. I think you're going to start to see a revolution in farming that everybody's going to start using cover crops, especially if we want to be serious about the nutrient reduction strategy. It's going to become just part of what we do. And I feel that we're going to solve our nutrient issues again. Cover crops are going to be a standard practice. This is a farm I rent. If any of you know where Highway 63 and Highway 9 come together at Davis Corners in Howard County, John Deere dealership here, I rent this farm. I've had it for about 12 years. The previous tenant, honest to God, would have pulled a plow behind the combine if they could got away with it. They moldboard plowed the corn stalks and they deep ripped the bean stubble in the fall just as soon as they could. I took it over. It was farmed north and south. None of these waterways were in. I had these established with a landlord through CRP, but you see here's a dead furrow, and I have not been able to get that stopped. I started farming it. I contoured it, so I come around here with a contour. Here's a CRP contour buffer strip, and then I farm this field this way. So my rows are going across the dead furrow. And this is that dead furrow. Every year it seems like I would plant a crop and it would kind of be a dip down there. I wouldn't get good seed to soil contact, so I'd get a poor stand to start with or no stand. And then when it would rain, it would just continually erode and follow that. I have plowed this in. I have chisel plowed it in. I've worked a field cultivator on it. I'm going to try cover crops. This actually went in. This is that dead furrow. I actually went in and just directly seeded cover crops in it. I think over time, we're going to get a root mass down there where it will maybe hold that. Then I'll come in and spray this with Roundup and just no-till plant into it. And then over time, hopefully I'll get a root mass there to stop that. But it's just been a continual problem. Strip till last year, I like strip till, it works. We had some problem with the strips washing out with the heavy rains that we had, especially on slopes. I had some that were 18 inches deep. It just washed it out. So again, cover crops, I'm seeing erosion on places that there should not be erosion with long-term no-till. The soil just gets looser, and so I think with the cover crops, we're going to start to get that root mass. The Russell, the soil loss equation, the only things you can change are your tillage and cropping and practices. And so again, the Russell, with Dave's situation, I've got a lot of guys that I do CNMPs with, and they're dairymen. They chop silage or they roll up their bales for feed or bedding. Then they go out and put manure on it, and then they deep rip it. So to make the Russell work is very challenging. To make the P-index work is very challenging. So we're trying to get them to look at putting cover crops in the system that we can bring it. If you're in a government program, you try to get those numbers down. This was Dave's. These are some of the potentials. You've been to other meetings and seen this. I've seen this where the weed control, again, when we went to no-till, my weed pressure changed. When I went to ridge-till, my weed pressure changed. When you go to cover crops, I guarantee you your weed pressure is going to change. And I don't know what it's going to be, whether it's going to be better or worse, but you will see different weed pressure. My farm, I'm in CSP. I can't put on more than 30 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant, so I put on about 30 pounds with the herbicide immediately after planting, and then I'll come back and side dress using the Adapt-N program. And those rates are based on the Cornell model. It's like running a late spring nitrate test. They'll send you a text message every morning on your cell phone saying that this is what you put on, and we feel that it's either adequate or you need some more, and that's what the model does. This was last year. This is my side dress rig, got a 16-row rig. I went out and found a tile line I'd put in 2 years before, and I had just filled the tank, so I've got a lot of dead weight there. I had fun trying to get that one out. Where that was right in here, so I gave up and I quit the field, and you can see where I didn't get nitrogen put on. And you've seen that before. So it's my strategy, nutrient management, doing that, soil and water conservation practices, and now I'm going to add cover crops to the mix. I'm going to hold the soil in place. I'm going to absorb what nutrients are there that are scavenged, and that's what we're going to do. Now, this was a quote I found. I do a lot of history reading, and I found this in a book. Anybody got an idea when this was put out? Who put it out? This was 1840. I found that remarkable, that how fit it is for today. When you look at that quote, the business I'm in is agriculture. The bottom line is we're packaging nitrogen for human consumption through proteins. That's basically what we do.